In the days when the early church was growing by leaps and bounds, when miracles were being performed, and when many people were being saved, people started complaining. Imagine that, even in the early days of the church, people complaining. Does that sound anything like the church today? As the old saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. In Acts 6, verse 1, we read, "And in those days, when the number of disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, because their widows were being neglected in the daily ministration." Most of us recall that the remainder of this chapter is devoted to the development of what we refer to today as our deacons, certain men who were chosen to help handle important works in the early days of the church. And continuing through today as we still choose men to help minister in the work of the church. But what I want to focus on tonight is the story contained in the first verse of Acts chapter 6 about a sudden and unexpected controversy that threatened to rip apart the early church. How it was handled and how the crisis became an opportunity makes for a fascinating story. Just look for a moment at verse 1, which tells us that the crisis happened as the number of disciples was increasing. Then jump all the way down to verse 7 and again note that the word of God spread rapidly as many people believed, and even priests became obedient to the faith. Instead of derailing the church, the crisis instead propelled it to even faster growth. Surely this was a mark of God's hand of blessing. Even the bad things work out for good. Romans 8, verse 28. What happens in Acts 6 takes place at the end of a period of severe persecution from which the church emerged stronger than ever. You see, Satan tried to stop the church through this persecution, but instead of arresting its development, he helped the church to get on with the job of being what God called it to be. Next, Satan tried to infiltrate the church through two blatant hypocrites known as Ananias and Sapphira, and we all know how God dealt with them. Then the devil tried to stop the church through division. Divide and conquer was his ultimate goal. He slipped into its ranks, and people started complaining about even the smallest of things. And that's where we find ourselves here in Acts chapter 6. At issue during the first century church were cultural differences. Greek culture was prevalent because of the conquest of Alexander the Great. And after the Romans conquered the Greeks and effectively bludgeoned the world into its submission, they adopted much of Greek culture, language, and even some of its religion. Greek influence was very strong in the ancient world of the New Testament. Some widows in the church were Jews who spoke Greek and probably had been raised outside of Jerusalem. Having returned to the Holy Land, they were mixing with what might be described as old school Hebrews. So basically, the church had a culture clash. And we still have the same problem, sadly, today in many of our churches. Every generation has a musical style or dress that they prefer. They have certain cultural customs, values, and behaviors they think are important. Sometimes they are based on a biblical concept, and other times they are simply personal preferences. But the church should never divide over these things. As one theologian stated, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. So here we find the problem fully defined. And in many cases, we can consider this the first case of racial prejudice in the Christian church. In the early days of the church, the apostles and their helpers could easily take care of everyone in the congregation. But because the church grew so fast, it outgrew its leadership base. Thousands joined the growing movement, and it was inevitable that some people or groups of people would fall through the cracks. This, along with the fact that the groups probably looked, acted, and sounded differently from each other, was a recipe for trouble. As long as things were going well, the differences could be ignored. However, the Jerusalem church was never rich, and eventually there were problems in the daily distribution of food for the widows for the two groups. The Hebrew-speaking Jewish Christian widows were being favored over the Greek-speaking Jewish Christian widows. While it may be easy for us to dismiss this today as a minor problem, it wasn't. In fact, it was a serious problem that demanded careful attention. Just consider some of the issues that churches split over today, issues much less important than what we see here in Acts chapter 6. So how would the church handle a problem like this today? How about the many denominations around the world? How would they handle it? Some might appoint a food distribution task force to study the matter and report to the elders. Or some might call a prayer meeting. Or we might have a business meeting and hash it out. Or perhaps shout it out would be more like it. Maybe we would end up starting a new church, the Jewish Christian Greek-speaking Church of Jerusalem number 1. Maybe we'd start a 2-lunch program, the traditional Hebrew lunch at 11:30 and the contemporary Greek lunch at 1. Sounds eerily familiar with what we see around the world today, doesn't it? If you put it in those terms, it seems very relevant for us today. So what about the solution contained in verses 2 through 6 of Acts chapter 6? In fact, the early church confronted this problem by a simple 4-step process. Number 1, they set priorities by having the 12 gather all the disciples together and set a clear statement of priorities. Second, they made a plan, and it began with congregational involvement. Brothers, choose 7 men out from among you, and a clear statement of qualifications. Third, they found the right people. And Luke tells us that the proposal won unanimous approval. Note all the men had Greek names, meaning they chose men from the Greek-speaking section of the church, who the members knew and were trusted. And finally, they commissioned the workers. They were presented to the apostles for their blessings and prayers, and this gave them added credibility among the members. Verse 7 brings us to the end of this episode from the early church. And there we find receptivity to the message. So the word of God spread. We see that there were many new converts, as the number of disciples of Jerusalem spread rapidly. And also we find that there were conversions in high places, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. So in conclusion, by God's grace, an interruption that threatened to danger the early church became an opportunity for growth. So what do we learn from this? Just these few verses in Acts 6 teach us of the importance of proper priorities in the work of the Lord. That it is impossible for a few people to do all the work of the local church. That there is blessing of many people using their gifts in many ways. And that there is value in serving others through practical deeds of kindness. All things so important to the work of the church, all the way from the time of the apostles through today. But one final point to this story that I'd like to point out is the setting aside of prejudices that we see in the world today, whether in the walls of this building or outside in our daily lives. It seems racial relations and the ability to coexist has been pushed to the forefront once again, not only in our churches but in society as a whole. And never is this more evident than during election year politics. If it was important for people to get along in unity and harmony despite their differences in culture, race, background, back in the first century church, then shouldn't we do the same today? As you look at candidates and political party priorities, make sure you give it the same thought that you would to fellow Christians here in worship to God. Instead of blindly supporting those who would build walls or blast derogatory terms toward those of a different race or background, let's instead look for workable solutions and give everyone the same opportunities that we've been blessed with. It'd be awfully difficult to persuade others to give their lives to Christ if they see us living with or upholding prejudices in our own. If you have a need tonight to give your life to Christ by entering into the waters of baptism, or if you have in some way strayed from the narrow way and desire the prayers of the church, you have that opportunity to come forward and give your life fully to Christ